Now, because an ecosystem contains different components to it, we often need the transport of water, or we often use water, or we would like water to be used in order to transfer different nutrients around. So, the component that is the atmosphere in an ecosystem is going to rely a lot on evaporation, and those water droplets do often carry other ions in there. Now, sometimes people get confused with, well, how do, acid rain, which often brings harm to plant life, how does that help or contribute to the nutrient cycle? Well, in some cases, it actually harms the nutrient cycle. But in other cases, acids are very good at breaking compounds down. And so where there's a lack of detrivores, often acid rain can actually help with the decomposition of different things, which then, in turn, releases nutrients or different kind of nutrients in the soil. Now, one of the most common forms of acid rain is carbonic acid, which is H2CO3 over here. And limestone, I wrote CO3 2-, which is a carbonate, but it's commonly calcium carbonate here, which again breaks down to the carbonate ion. And what you end up getting is you get an erosion of your calcium carbonate, and you're left with your bicarbonate ion, or your calcium bicarbonate. And so that becomes an entirely different thing altogether, and it's kind of more of a powdery substance, which is something you would see over here. So you do get a chemical reaction, and that's just on marble. Now, not that this is a bad thing, but the erosion of marble is an indication often that acid rain has occurred. Now, on the forest and pond ecosystems, it is almost catastrophic. So over here on the right, you can see that there's a bunch of dead fish and species, and they often are the most harmed. And the reason for that is that as acid rain flows through the soils in a watershed, you get aluminum that gets released, from the soils, and it goes into the lakes, and that poisons the fish. This same aluminum that enters the soil can also harm the plants and the trees and often stunt their growth. So over here you see that there's no leaves on these trees, and that's because, again, the aluminum release stunted that growth. What they can also do is, and I'm referring to this is actually an egg, so the shell has been dissolved, right, by, normally would be acetic acid, but that's also something that's possible, or that's a possible type of acid rain. And you got the shell that's been peeled off. It's calcium carbonate on the outside of the shell. So your calcium carbonate, CaCO3, is removed from acid, or by the acid, I should say. And then what happens is this creates a hypotonic solution. And what that means is that if your cell is placed in a hypotonic solution, it's going to swell, right? So your cells will swell and eventually explode. Now, the reason why this hypotonic solution gets created is because now that there's a bunch of aluminum created here, so I'm writing in the Al3+, let's say, there's more aluminum that has been uptaken by the cells, the plant cells, or whatever have you inside the environment, and now the water is going to want to move into the cells in order to dilute so that the concentration of aluminum is equal on both sides of the cell, that being inside or outside of the cell. And so you end up having a hypotonic solution, and the cell will swell until it explodes and dies, and this is called cytolysis. One of them being that if you are collecting and capturing carbon, you give it more opportunities to form the greenhouse gas compounds like carbon dioxide and methane. And so what these gases are going to do is trap heat inside the atmosphere, and this could ultimately lead to global warming, which then you're changing the ecosystems that some of the species rely on. Now, of course, here are some of the unfortunate after effects of honestly human activities. When we talk about the greenhouse effect, we're talking about the effect that certain gases have on the atmosphere. So greenhouse gases, or GHGs, act like a blanket that kind of trap heat in. And so imagine you have a layer of greenhouse gases, and when you got your incoming solar radiation, most of it that's supposed to be reflected back actually gets blanketed and resurfaces here. And so as a result, right, the reflected excess heat, or excess, so that which is extra, gets resurfaced, and this leads to overall warming. Now, when we're talking about deforestation, we're talking about the loss of trees and vegetation due to non-forest activities like house building, etc. And the issue with these, or with deforestation, is that it can lead to, well, climate change, for one, and then that, or I should say also, it can lead to desertification. So, the formation of deserts where it's not naturally supposed to form. It can also lead to flooding and soil erosion. And of course, the larger problem at hand here is global warming or climate change. Now, climate naturally changes, so I don't think the scientists are discussing, the natural shift or the continental shift that happens, over a millennia, etc. But we're talking about the uncontrolled, unexpected, and unnatural climate change, and that would be from human activity. And a lot of the times climate science is misquoted, right? Because, they'll refer back to the dinosaurs. Well, the earth has been warmer than this before. And while that may be true, for that time, that was a natural climate change. We're talking about the unnatural, unanticipated climate change. And that's what has disastrous effects. Now, like every other cycle, the oxygen cycle is what really helps move oxygen around the earth, but it is quite complicated. So we could break it down into two categories when we look at each part of the cycle. One is a source, and that's where oxygen is, you could say, created, okay, and then, or released. And then you have a sink where oxygen is consumed. So certain parts of the cycle consume oxygen and other parts generate oxygen. Most of the oxygen actually comes from the lithosphere, which is beneath the Earth's crust. The atmosphere, right, so up in the sky, is really only about 20% oxygen. The hydrosphere, so the water cycle, is about 33% oxygen. And then the biosphere, right, the sphere holding all living elements, is about 22%, and most of that comes from organic molecules or compounds. So in the atmosphere is where you get most of photolysis, where the sun, which really acts like a catalyst, separates water into hydrogen and oxygen, ozone and UV. And ozone is O3, right? Sand from the lithosphere has a bunch of silicates, which the chemical compound or formula for silicates, okay, is SiO3. So that's why it is an oxygen source if you're able to separate the oxygen. But what generally happens is this. So most of your oxygen comes from the atmosphere into the lithosphere, right? And then to the biosphere. Now the plants, through photosynthesis, they produce oxygen right over here. And then primarily, that's how it gets into the atmosphere. So when we're thinking about sources of oxygen, that would mostly be the plants. And you could say the photolysis part of the atmosphere, right, where water is actually broken down. And so these create oxygen. Now, once it reaches the biosphere and cellular respiration occurs, then you have animals that consume oxygen. And so these would be the sink portion in the cycle. Other sinks of oxygen would be the fossil fuel combustion, as in every combustion reaction, you have oxygen that is consumed and then carbon dioxide and water that gets produced, right? And so those are other sinks of carbon dioxide. Other plants use oxygen, right? It's not plants, but other organisms use oxygen to help plants decay. And so these are other sinks. So I'm going to write used by, you could say bacteria or detrivores. Now, one of the important, I should say, heat reservoirs is the albedo effect. And that refers to a surface's ability, right, to reflect heat or incoming solar radiation. Lighter colors tend to have higher albedo values, so they're able to reflect incoming solar radiation much better. So if you look at the values here, fresh snow at the top of a mountain is going to have pretty high albedo values, and that's why it tends to stay colder over there. Whereas forests have lower values. Concrete, even worse. That's why it tends to feel so hot when you walk on fresh asphalt on a hot summer day. And so in short, the higher the albedo or the general albedo values of the land, the more heat is going to be reflected and the colder that place is likely to be. And so when we look at places like Greenland, where it has very high albedo values because it is largely covered in ice.